The murmur of hushed conversations filled the first-class cabin, blending with the subtle hum of the engines. The air was crisp, the lighting dimmed just enough to create an atmosphere of exclusivity. Melania Trump sat in quiet elegance, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. Outside, the vast stretch of night sky was a blanket of darkness, interrupted only by the distant glow of city lights thousands of feet below. She was used to eyes following her, used to the whispers, the sideways glances, the weight of expectations pressing down on her like an invisible force. It came with the name, with the history, with the life she had chosen. But this time, the scrutiny felt different. A flight attendant, a young woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, hovered nearby. Her uniform, though professional, was fitted in a way that accentuated her figure, the blouse slightly unbuttoned at the top. She held a tray with one hand, a polite smile stretching across her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. Melania glanced up, her expression as smooth as porcelain. "A sparkling water, please," she said, her tone effortlessly soft, yet firm. The attendant nodded, but instead of turning away, she lingered. The pause was subtle, but deliberate. Then, her lips curled at the corners in something almost amused, as if she were enjoying a private joke at Melania's expense. "You know," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I wasn't sure if I should serve you at all." For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. A businessman, 2 rows ahead, lowered his newspaper. A woman across the aisle subtly pulled out her phone. The soft clinking of ice in a glass from the bar area came to a halt, as if even the cabin crew had sensed the shift in atmosphere. Melania didn't react immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, let the weight of the words settle into the air like turbulence before a storm. Then, with the elegance of someone who had weathered far greater storms, she lifted her gaze, her piercing blue eyes meeting the attendant's with quiet intensity. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone neither angry nor surprised, just dangerously calm. The attendant's smile tightened. "Oh, don't worry," she said, with a casual flick of her wrist. "I just meant, some of us feel that people like you shouldn't be treated like royalty. You know, considering everything." The weight of the moment pressed down on the cabin. The meaning was clear. The message behind her words left no room for misinterpretation. And now, the passengers, once mere observers in a private first-class world, had become an audience. Melania tilted her head slightly, her expression betraying nothing. If the words had stung, she didn't show it. Instead, she studied the woman in front of her, as if deciding whether she was worth a response at all. Finally, with an air of effortless control, she gave a small, knowing smile. "Interesting," she murmured. "And tell me, who decides who belongs?" The response was like a quiet thunderclap, soft, yet powerful enough to shift the energy in the room. The flight attendant blinked, clearly thrown off by the unexpected question. A muscle in her jaw twitched. It was clear she had anticipated something different: outrage, defensiveness, maybe even silence. But what she had received was something far more dangerous. Control. Melania still had control. For the first time, the flight attendant faltered. A hush had fallen over the passengers, their eyes darting between the 2 women. The businessman who had lowered his newspaper now openly watched. A younger woman in a designer coat subtly adjusted her phone's angle, ensuring the camera captured everything. The balance of power had shifted. The flight attendant opened her mouth as if to say something, to reclaim authority over the moment, but nothing came out. She wasn't winning this fight. And she knew it. But she wasn't ready to back down just yet. Instead, she squared her shoulders and leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, but just enough that the surrounding passengers could still hear. "You should know," she said, her tone laced with barely concealed arrogance, "that not everyone here is happy to share this space with someone like you. A ripple of tension spread like wildfire through the cabin. A few gasps were muffled. The businessman let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head slightly. Someone near the bar whispered, and somewhere in the background, a phone's recording light blinked red. Melania didn't blink, didn't react. Instead, she reached for the glass bottle of sparkling water that had been set down earlier. The soft hiss of the cap twisting open was the only sound in the cabin. She lifted the bottle slowly, took a single unhurried sip, then placed it back onto the tray table with measured precision. Then, finally, she lifted her eyes back to the flight attendant and, with the ease of someone who had already won the battle before it had even begun, said, "And yet, here I am." Silence. The attendant's face flushed red. The businessman let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. A woman in the second row raised an eyebrow, as if impressed. The phone in the background was still recording. The moment had already gone viral. The flight attendant swallowed, her posture stiff. She had taken the first shot, but somehow, she was the one who had lost. Melania, as poised as ever, tilted her head slightly, as if waiting to see what her opponent would do next. But there was no need, because the world was already watching. The first-class cabin had gone eerily silent, the kind of silence that only came when something unexpected, uncomfortable, and electric unfolded before an audience that didn't know whether to intervene or simply watch. The air felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken energy that clung to every passenger. No one rustled a newspaper, no one adjusted their seat. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, caught between the drama of the moment and the realization that it was spiraling into something far bigger than just a drink order gone wrong. Jessica, the flight attendant, knew she had made a mistake. She could feel it in the way the businessman had spoken, in the way the passengers had shifted, in the way her own confidence had started to crumble under the weight of the moment. And yet, her pride wouldn't let her back down. Her fingers clenched around the tray she still held, her knuckles whitening with the force of frustration. She had set out to make a statement, to remind a powerful woman that she wasn't untouchable. But now the room was watching her, dissecting her every move, waiting to see whether she would fix her mistake or make it even worse. Melania remained seated, completely still, completely composed, her gaze fixed on Jessica with an expression so perfectly unreadable that it almost felt cruel. There was no anger, no amusement, no indication that she was flustered or insulted, only that she had already won before Jessica even realized the game had started. The former First Lady hadn't raised her voice, hadn't stood up, hadn't demanded anything. And yet, she had already stripped Jessica of the very control she thought she had. It was a quiet kind of dominance, the kind that didn't require a single outburst to shift the balance of power. Jessica inhaled sharply, her chest rising with the kind of irritation that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with losing face. She had expected Melania to react, to lash out, to demand an apology, to make this into something that would justify her own aggression. Instead, she had received nothing but silence, a silence that was now suffocating. But what stung the most was the slow creeping realization that she wasn't just up against Melania anymore. The entire cabin had turned against her. Even the passengers who might have agreed with her politically were now watching with growing unease, realizing that this was no longer about personal beliefs, but professionalism, respect, and dignity. For the first time she hesitated, but it was already too late. A cough broke the silence, sharp and deliberate. Jessica turned slightly, her eyes flickering toward the businessman who had spoken earlier. He wasn't looking at her anymore. Instead, he was scrolling through his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting off the rim of his glasses. With a slow shake of his head, he muttered, "You might want to check the news." Jessica's stomach twisted. She took an instinctive step back, pulling her own phone from her pocket, ignoring the fact that she wasn't even supposed to have it out during service. The moment she unlocked the screen, a notification flashed at the top, then another, and another. Her pulse quickened. The realization hit her all at once. This wasn't just a cabin incident anymore. This was everywhere. Passengers had been recording, live streaming, uploading. The headlines were already forming before the plane had even landed. Breaking: first-class drama unfolds as flight attendant publicly confronts Melania Trump. Viral video shows heated exchange in first class. Flight attendant in trouble? Disrespect or speaking truth? Internet divided over airplane showdown. Her breath came short, shallow. It had barely been 20 minutes, and already the world was watching. The likes, the comments, the retweets, her name wasn't in them yet. But it was only a matter of time before someone found out who she was. Melania hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't needed to. And that was the worst part. Jessica had gone into this thinking she was the one with the upper hand, but Melania had played the game without even lifting a finger. She had let Jessica destroy herself, let the cameras capture the moment, let the weight of public perception do all the work. Now it didn't matter what her intentions had been. It only mattered how the world saw her. Her hands trembled slightly as she locked her phone and forced herself to stand straighter, to regain control of what little authority she had left. She cleared her throat, forcing a tight smile as she turned back to Melania. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" she asked, her voice stiff, almost robotic. Melania lifted her water, took a slow sip, and finally spoke. "You've already given me everything I need." Jessica flinched. A ripple of quiet chuckles spread through the cabin. It was over. And she knew it. The weight of the moment settled in like turbulence before a storm, pressing into the walls of the first-class cabin, making the air feel heavier with every second that passed. Jessica, the once confident flight attendant, stood frozen, gripping the tray in her hands as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her face was a shade paler than before, her polished exterior cracking beneath the immense pressure she had unwittingly placed upon herself. She had walked into this moment thinking she held the power, believing she was making some kind of righteous stand, but now, she was the story. The low hum of the airplane's engines wasn't enough to drown out the subtle murmurs creeping through the cabin. A woman across the aisle whispered something to her seatmate, their expressions a mix of intrigue and disbelief. The businessman in the crisp suit, who had already spoken twice, leaned back in his seat, watching Jessica with the kind of gaze one reserved for a car crash in slow motion. A quiet snicker came from somewhere in the back. Someone else snapped another picture. Jessica's phone, tucked away in her uniform pocket, vibrated again and again. She didn't need to look at it. She already knew. The damage had been done. Her name was out there now, her face plastered across screens worldwide, her fate in the hands of an internet that decided who would be forgiven and who would be canceled beyond repair. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. There had to be a way out. A way to rewrite what had just happened, to take back control of the narrative before it spiraled even further out of her grasp. She had convinced herself that she was the one delivering the lesson, that she was standing up for something greater, but now she realized she was the one being taught a lesson. Melania, meanwhile, hadn't moved. She hadn't had to. She remained seated, still radiating the same quiet dominance, the same unshakable composure that had dismantled Jessica's confidence without a single raised word. It was the power of restraint, of knowing when to act and when to let others bury themselves. Jessica swallowed hard, knowing she had to say something, anything to regain control, but no words came. What could she possibly say now? "I was just joking? You're taking it the wrong way?" No, that ship had sailed, burned, and sunk to the ocean floor. She glanced down at Melania's water bottle, still half full, the condensation leaving faint rings on the small table. There was no going back now. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent and will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in the upright position." Jessica's pulse spiked. The flight was ending. Time was running out. From the corner of her eye, she saw another flight attendant approaching her superior, no doubt. The woman's expression was neutral, professional, but Jessica knew what was coming. She was about to be removed from service. The businessman exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly as he folded his hands together. The audience had made up its mind. And Melania? She simply reached for her water, lifted it one last time, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Then, placing it down with the softest of clinks, she finally looked back up at Jessica. "You should sit down." The words were not cruel, not triumphant, but filled with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly where she stood. And just like that, Jessica lost. She felt it in her bones, in her chest, in the suffocating finality of the moment. Her fingers curled tightly around the tray as she took a shaky breath, forcing herself to step backward. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. She knew there was nothing left to say. And so, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. The flight attendant who had started the war was now retreating. The flight was ending, but for Jessica, this was just the beginning, because when she stepped off this plane, the real turbulence would begin. As the plane touched down, the tension in the first-class cabin did not lift. The hum of the engines winding down, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off, none of it broke the heavy atmosphere still lingering from what had just transpired. Passengers shifted in their seats, gathering their belongings, but their eyes remained glued to their phones, scrolling through the explosion of headlines and viral posts. The moment had already left the cabin and entered the digital world, where it would be dissected, debated, and reshaped by millions of strangers before the flight crew had even opened the doors. Jessica sat stiffly in the crew's designated jump seat near the galley, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her uniform, once crisp and professional, now felt restrictive, suffocating. The weight of what had happened pressed into her chest, the finality of it sinking in. She had started the flight with confidence, convinced she was the one with control. But now she could feel it slipping away, unraveling with each notification lighting up her phone. From the front of the cabin, Melania Trump stood effortlessly, adjusting the sleeves of her white coat as she reached for her handbag. She didn't rush. She didn't react. She simply moved with the grace of someone who knew the battle had already been won long before it had even begun. As she stepped into the aisle, a murmur rippled through the cabin. It wasn't applause. It wasn't cheers. But it was something. A quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition of how she had carried herself through the ordeal. Cameras flashed the second she stepped off the plane. Reporters, already tipped off by the viral storm brewing online, stood in a line like predators waiting for their chance to pounce. Microphones jutted forward, voices clashing in a storm of desperate questions. "Mrs. Trump, do you have a comment on what happened? Do you believe the flight attendant should be fired? Is this political harassment? Will you be suing the airline?" Melania didn't stop. She slid her sunglasses over her eyes, her lips curving into the barest hint of a knowing smile. And just like that, she was gone. But Jessica wasn't so lucky. She stepped off the plane seconds later, her stomach churning as she realized the cameras had turned to her now. Someone had recognized her. Someone had said her name aloud, and before she could so much as take a breath, she knew she was the next headline. She had wanted attention. Now she had it. For all the wrong reasons. As the plane touched down, the tension in the first-class cabin did not lift. The hum of the engines winding down, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off, none of it broke, the heavy atmosphere still lingering from what had just transpired. Passengers shifted in their seats, gathering their belongings, but their eyes remained glued to their phones, scrolling through the explosion of headlines and viral posts. The moment had already left the cabin and entered the digital world, where it would be dissected, debated, and reshaped by millions of strangers before the flight crew had even opened the doors. Jessica sat stiffly in the crew's designated jump seat near the galley, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her uniform, once crisp and professional, now felt restrictive, suffocating. The weight of what had happened pressed into her chest, the finality of it sinking in. She had started the flight with confidence, convinced she was the one with control. But now she could feel it slipping away, unraveling with each notification lighting up her phone. From the front of the cabin, Melania Trump stood effortlessly, adjusting the sleeves of her white coat as she reached for her handbag. She didn't rush. She didn't react. She simply moved with the grace of someone who knew the battle had already been won long before it had even begun. As she stepped into the aisle, a murmur rippled through the cabin. It wasn't applause. It wasn't cheers. But it was something. A quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition of how she had carried herself through the ordeal. Cameras flashed the second she stepped off the plane. Reporters, already tipped off by the viral storm brewing online, stood in a line like predators waiting for their chance to pounce. Microphones jutted forward, voices clashing in a storm of desperate questions. "Mrs. Trump, do you have a comment on what happened? Do you believe the flight attendant should be fired? Is this political harassment? Will you be suing the airline?" Melania didn't stop. She slid her sunglasses over her eyes, her lips curving into the barest hint of a knowing smile. And just like that, she was gone. But Jessica wasn't so lucky. She stepped off the plane seconds later, her stomach churning as she realized the cameras had turned to her now. Someone had recognized her. Someone had said her name aloud, and before she could so much as take a breath, she knew she was the next headline. She had wanted attention. Now she had it. For all the wrong reasons. This was more than just a flight. It was a moment the world won't forget. Melania Trump never had to raise her voice, because power isn't about who speaks the loudest. And now, the internet has already decided ... What do you think? Did the flight attendant go too far, or was this karma at work? Let us know in the comments. And if you think this was shocking, just wait for the next one. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and never miss a story that will leave you speechless.